So welcome to you all. I'm Paul Willey. I'm a member of the conference organising committee and also a volunteer activist.
A version of a recorded interview that I conducted with Herman Daly, who's probably the world's leading ecological economist. I'm doing this, giving you a bit of an introduction to ecological economics, because I think ecological economics, well, apart from anything else, we've got about 3 or 4 ecological economists who will be presenting throughout the conference. But ecological economics raises some key issues related to sustainable prosperity that I think are quite often overlooked, especially by mainstream economists. And I think ecological economics offers some valuable insights and possible policies to promote sustainable prosperity. So I'm going to go through this presentation that I've got before the interview fairly quickly. So if you have any queries, well, I'm hoping that what Herman Daly's got to say will clarify your concerns. All right. So I'm going to imagine, or want you to imagine, that you've just enrolled into an economics degree, a Bachelor of Economics, and you're studying Econ 101, and this is a textbook view of the economy. And basically, with the textbook view of the economy and first year economics, the economy's basically just treated as an isolated and independent system. So there's no connection with the outside. And inside this economy, we have a private sector, and that private sector consists of firms and households. Households own the factors of production, and by factors of production I'm talking about things like human-made capital, so it's plant, machinery and equipment, labour and natural resources, and they supply them to firms. And firms utilise those factors of production to produce goods and services, and that's commonly referred to as the national product. Firms pay the factors of production for their use, which is income, and that income is retained profits and dividends to capital, wages to labour, rents to resource owners and landowners, and so forth. And households use their income to purchase goods and services. Okay. This is basically the mainstream circular flow model of the economy that you learn in first year economics. Now, you can include the government and the rest of the world, but basically it's simplified, so you have this circular flow model of the economy. And you'll probably notice that one thing that's missing from this particular diagram is the natural environment. So there's no connection with or reliance upon anything outside the economy. The economy is just a self-contained system. Okay, so then in second year, you get through first year, and then you do environmental economics. And this is a requisite topic, it's a compulsory topic. The thing about environmental economics, it's very different to ecological economics, and it will soon become obvious why, is that environmental economics is still very, very mainstream based. The main difference between your second year environmental economics and your first year mainstream economics, Econ 101, is that environmental economics at least recognise the importance of and some connection with the natural environment. But the economy is only tenuously linked to the natural environment in environmental economics. So the economy is able to grow indefinitely and to avoid at negligible take-up cost, and any costs imposed by the economy on the natural environment are regarded as externalities. Okay. There are no costs imposed on the natural environment due to the scale of the economy, the actual physical size or scale of the economy in environmental economics. That's very different with ecological economics. So then you study in third year Econ 301 ecological economics. It's an elective topic. And you have to be very lucky to do this elective topic. There's probably only about 12 universities in the world where you can do this particular topic. And with ecological economics, the economy is considered a subsystem of a finite natural, non-growing natural environment. So it's considered a subsystem because that's what it is. It is a subsystem of the natural environment, and that natural environment is finite and non-growing. Production within the economy requires the ongoing input of natural resources sourced from the natural environment. Goods and services are produced, then they're consumed. Consumption of goods generates waste, which ultimately returns to the natural environment. So this input of resources and output of waste is considered the throughput. It's the throughput that sustains the economy, that physically sustains the economy. And there exists a maximum sustainable rate of throughput. So that input of resources, output of waste, that can be increased and it can sustain a larger economy, but there's a limit to how of the magnitude of that particular rate of throughput beyond which it becomes unsustainable. So throughput can only be increased so much before it becomes ecologically unsustainable. That quantity of resources that's entering the economy is then allocated to produce various goods and services. So I've just got some goods and services in blue. They're what are referred to as private goods: cars, iPhones, food, clothes, TVs, machines. And the ones in red are public goods: schools, hospitals, roads, public transport and so forth. So an important consideration for ecological economics is similar to what Bill Mitchell referred to, and also with mainstream economics to some extent, and that is the allocation of the incoming resource flow. What is produced? How many cars? How many iPhones? Should they be consumption goods? Should they be capital goods? Capital goods are goods that produce tomorrow's goods. Should they be public goods or private goods and so forth? How are they produced? What method of production do we use? We would obviously prefer the most efficient method. And should they be produced and supplied by the private or the public sector? And that's particularly important, and it may arise again throughout the conference, because if it's provided by the public sector, and if we are to deal with climate change, we are going to have to basically retrofit the public infrastructure that we have that supports our economies to a low energy and low carbon infrastructure. That infrastructure will have public goods characteristics, particular features, which will mean that a lot of the investment will have to be undertaken by governments. So ecological economists believe that governments will have a significant role to play in our transition to a low or energy efficient and low carbon economy. And of course that raises the issue, because the question that's always asked, if the public sector is going to fund a lot of this investment, is where is the money going to come from? And that's where modern monetary theory comes into it. In fact, that's one of my criticisms of a lot of ecological economists. They need to know a bit more modern monetary theory here. We want the allocation of the incoming resources to be efficient. That is, we want to maximise the benefits from each unit of resources used. Distribution. So distribution is another concern. Distribution is who gets what. Who gets to own, possess, access cars, iPhones, schools, hospitals and so forth. So there's a strong emphasis on the part of ecological economists on the equitable distribution of income and wealth. And of course the notion of full employment also plays a significant part here. And then, of course, there's an issue that's completely overlooked by virtually all economists other than ecological economists, and that's scale. How big should the economy be? How much stuff should we produce? How much is sustainable? How big can the economy get before the throughput required to sustain it or maintain it becomes ecologically unsustainable? Okay, so with that very, very short introduction to ecological economics, I'll just introduce and say a few things about Herman Daly. Herman Daly was, he's the alumni professor of economics at the Louisiana State University. He finished off and is now emeritus professor, retired professor at the University of Maryland. He spent some time as the senior economist at the Environment Department of the World Bank, a 7-year period. He was the co-founder of ecological economics, and when I say co-founder, I'm not just talking about the sub-discipline of ecological economics, but also the journal Ecological Economics. He's written many books, many papers, but 3 books that probably stand out most are Steady State Economics, For the Common Good and Beyond Growth. He's the co-creator of the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, which is now called the Genuine Progress Indicator, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow. And he's won numerous awards, and probably the 3 most prestigious awards are the Right Livelihood Award, the Heineken Prize for Environmental Science, which I think is sort of an alternative Nobel Prize, I've been told, and the Blue Planet Prize. So there's a little bit about Herman Daly. Okay, now for the interview. I think we might be set up for this. Yep, so just bear with us for a couple of minutes.
Well, hopefully it won't be a couple of minutes, will it?
All right. Asking Professor Daly if you could outline the three main issues of focus of ecological economics.
Ecological economics deals with three areas. One is the problem of sustainable scale of the total economy relative to the biosphere, which it is a part. Second, the equitable distribution of resources and income within that economy. And third, the efficient allocation of those resources among alternative product uses. Now, those three things are in a particular sequence, and in ecological economics you start with a scale, then the distribution, and then the allocation. That's pretty much the reverse of the order of consideration in standard economics. Standard economics looks mainly at efficient allocation. Then it says, well, in order to define an efficient Pareto optimal allocation, you have to know the distribution. So each efficient allocation is on the basis of some given distribution. So the distribution has to be known. As for scale, that's completely off the radar screen. There is no concept of the scale of the economy relative to the ecosystem. And I think that's the big starting point for ecological economics, because standard economics does not conceive of the economy as a subsystem of a larger natural biophysical ecosystem. It's just the total. I mean, when we say macroeconomics, we don't mean just economics of big things. We mean the economics of the total. And when we say microeconomic, we don't just mean little things. We mean the economics of the part. So we've got a big philosophical problem here of the whole versus the part. And standard economics has assumed that the macroeconomy is the whole, so that when it grows, it just grows into the void. It does not grow into a containing and constraining ecosystem. There is no opportunity cost of the expansion. There's no takeover of anything else. So all that just gets left out of standard economics, and it's the main purpose of ecological economics to correct that misperception of the way the world is.
Okay. So in his answer to that particular question, Professor Daly explained how ecological economics recognises the economy. Professor Daly, to expand on why it is important to focus attention on the overall size of the economy relative to the natural environment.
Those are the sort of the immediate analytical questions by standard economics. First, how big is the economy relative to the ecosystem? What are the proper terms of measurement? How much of the total captured photosynthetic energy is devoted to the economy, and how much is left over for the rest of the ecosystem, or just in terms of acreage, or more accurately, things like the ecological footprint. So how big is the economy relative to the ecosystem? Secondly, would be how big can it be? At what point do you destroy the life support system coming from the larger system to such a degree that it destroys the dependent economy? And then the third question, I guess the one that most resonates with economists, is how big should it be? At what point does the expansion of the economy cost more in terms of sacrificed ecosystem services than it benefits us in terms of extra production services? So even before growth or expansion of the subsystem becomes physically impossible, it becomes uneconomic. It simply costs more than it's worth, and I believe we're in that stage now. And you would hope that economists would be concerned about the benefits versus the costs of expansion of the total scale of the economy. But so far, that has not really been the case.
Okay. So in view of what Professor Daly believes is a need to compare the benefits and costs of a growing economy, I asked him to elaborate on his distinction between growth and development.
Yes, to some degree it's a distinction that comes from the dictionary. At least it has some validation in the dictionary. But to give it a more precise definition, growth is a quantitative physical concept. When something grows, it gets bigger, either by accretion or assimilation of matter. So that's growth. Development, by contrast, is a qualitative notion. Development means that something is getting different, hopefully better, but possibly worse, more complex, more interrelated. So development is improvement in organization, in the ordering of priorities, and in technology. So those are qualitative things which are lumped under development. Really important.
Yeah, keep going.
Important for the future, I think, is development, qualitative improvement, and improvement in the ordering of our priorities and improvement in technology.
Okay. All right. So from what Professor Daly has so far said, it should be clear that the physical scale of the economy and the sustained economic activity is important from an ecological sustainability perspective. For some time, Professor Daly has suggested that policies to achieve ecological sustainability should be based on a few basic sustainability rules. I asked Professor Daly to outline them for us.
The importance of throughput was made clear to me when I got interested through my main teacher, Nicholas Georgescu-Rogan, when he emphasized the importance of the entropy law for economics, so that throughput begins with structured, organized, useful matter and energy, and it ends with waste, which is unstructured, scattered, dissipated matter and energy. And we have also the first law of thermodynamics: matter and energy is neither created nor destroyed. So we're just converting useful stuff into waste stuff. And that seems to be a very costly activity. And yet it doesn't enter. Now, it would be a stupid thing if we just remained within physical dimensions, just grinding up the world and turning useful stuff into useless stuff. But of course, that it's necessary in order to maintain and enjoy life. So it's not something we can stop doing, but it is something we can minimize and not do in an excessive or wasteful fashion. Now, as for the three sort of rules, that was when I was working for the World Bank, and the World Bank was tasked by the United Nations with the idea of come up with ideas for sustainable development. What does sustainable development mean? Of course, with the Brundtland report, it advocated sustainable development, but nobody really knew what it meant. And so there was a big effort to try to define it because everyone was in favor of it, but nobody knew what it meant. So if you could define it, you suddenly got a big political victory. This and others that I worked with, we were doing it as a team. At the project level, the World Bank finances projects. So if a project is going to be sustainable, what are the criteria, the conditions that it should meet? And we came up with these three. If harvest rates of renewable resources should not exceed regeneration rates. So a project that depends on renewable resources it should be such that you should not, the offtake of the renewable resource should not be greater than the regeneration rate. So you're consuming natural income rather than natural capital. Secondly, we said that the extraction, if it's based on non-renewable resources, then the depletion rate should not exceed the creation of renewable substitutes. It should not exceed the rate of invention of renewable substitutes. I'll come back to that in a minute. That was the hard one. And then the third one, the rate of waste generation, whether generated from renewable or non-renewable sources, waste generation should not exceed the assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. So those are the criteria we came up with, and we realized these not only would apply at a project level, but they're fairly easily generalizable to the economy as a whole, that a sustainable economy should also, in the aggregate, meet those criteria.
Okay. I suggested to Professor Daly that what he was saying, that there is a need to keep the stock of natural capital intact. And by natural capital, I mean the stock of forests, fisheries, waste-absorbing wetlands, critical ecosystems, and the Earth's climate system. I pointed out that many mainstream economists would respond by saying that the depletion of natural capital is of no concern if it is offset by increases in the stock of human-made capital, so stocks of plant machinery and equipment. Professor Daly strongly disagrees with this proposition. I asked him why.
Man-made capital and natural capital, I would say, are fundamentally complements and not substitutes. And there's a tendency to want to treat them as substitutes, perhaps because they're both called capital. And but if you just, I don't want to go into production functions too much here, but if you just think of the way neoclassical economists view production, their production function consists of just two factors. It consists of labor and man-made capital. So you think, well, maybe we'll just throw in natural capital as another form of capital and it'll substitute in there for man-made capital. Well, natural capital really doesn't enter the production function as a stock or a fund. It really, natural capital generates a flow of natural resources. And what enters the production function is the flow of natural resources which are generated immediately from natural capital. And that's where the complementarity comes in, because the process of production is transforming a flow of natural resources derived from natural capital into a flow of products and wastes. And so that's the complementarity. Man-made capital is the transforming agent which converts the flow of natural resources into products. So if there are substitutes, one for the other, then neither one can be limiting. If you have a shortage of one, you just substitute more of the other. But if the factors are complementary, then you can have a limiting factor. It won't do any good to substitute more of the abundant factor if the scarce factor is limiting. And so what we've had over time then with growth, with exponential growth, is a change in the limiting factor in production. The limiting factor used to be man-made capital and labor because natural resources were superabundant. Now that pattern of scarcity has been reversed. And what's the superabundant factors are labor and man-made capital. And what's scarce is the flow of natural resources. So we really have to change our economizing away from man-made capital and towards economizing on natural capital. And that's a major change in the pattern of scarcity to which we have really not adapted.
Okay. At this point, I steered the interview towards the policy sphere and highlighted Daly's liking for cap auction trade systems as a means of promoting sustainable development. Now, before I read out the question and I play Daly's answer, I better say a few things about cap auction trade systems if you're not familiar with them. So let me just say a few things for a couple of minutes. Now, cap auction trade systems can be designed various ways, and if they're not designed properly, they fail. But if they were properly designed, they would work along the following lines. So let's say you are a natural resource supplier. For example, you own a forestry company and you harvest timber from forests that will be used to produce timber-based products. With a cap auction trade system in place, you will extract timber in the usual fashion, but, and this is the key point, but you will first need to purchase permits from a regulatory authority to gain access to timber-yielding forests. For example, a permit might allow you to harvest 1 tonne of timber. If you wish to harvest 50 tonnes of timber, you must purchase 50 permits. For each tonne of timber you harvest, you must forfeit one of your permits. So you buy the permits, and once you do the harvesting, you forfeit the permits. If the regulatory authority wishes to limit the total harvest of timber per year to, say, 1,000 tonnes, because this is the maximum sustainable rate of timber extraction, it will restrict the number of permits it sells to 1,000 permits per year. The permits are sold or auctioned by the regulatory authority to the highest bidders. Importantly, the limited number of permits sold by the regulatory authority sets a cap. So it sets a cap on the volume of timber extracted over a period of time. And you want that cap to be set in such a way that you can extract timber on a sustainable basis, using the first rule that Herman Daly talked about, harvest rates not exceeding the regeneration rate of a renewable resource. Another important feature of cap auction trade systems is that they can also be designed to regulate pollution and emissions levels. So emissions trading systems for greenhouse gases and so forth. In the case of pollution, the cap is placed on pollution levels, for obvious reasons, and a polluter must purchase a pollution permit to legally generate emissions. Okay, so I asked Professor Daly if he could enlighten us on how cap auction trade systems could resolve the 3 policy goals that ecological economists believe are central to achieving sustainable development. And by those 3 policy goals, of course, I'm referring to sustainable scale, equitable distribution and efficient allocation.
What I think is really nice about the cap auction trade system is that it deals specifically with the 3 goals that we started out discussing, and it deals with them in proper sequence. It says, well, there's a resource which is scarce, which we have not been treating as scarce. Maybe it's the ability of the environment to assimilate CO2 without warming. Well, that's scarce. And but the first step then is to put a limit, a quantitative limit on some estimate of how much the environment, the atmosphere in a particular area can absorb. Put that physical limit there. Okay, once you put a physical limit on something which in the past was not limited, then it's become valuable. It has a price. It's a valuable asset. So then comes in the distribution question. Who owns it? Who owns the right to dump things in the atmosphere? Well, we have to deal with that question, and we can do that by putting that limit and then auctioning off the right to pollute to the highest bidder. So that's a way of doing that. And we can take the auction receipts, which would be substantial, and devote those to lowering taxes. We could lower first the most regressive taxes and build in a benefit to the poor. Or as some people would prefer, we could just give an equal social dividend to everyone. Or we could just, use it to establish a general minimum income and a maximum income to limit the distribution inequality. So, and then once you have faced up to the question of scale, which is a big field where the market will just run roughshod over the scale of the economy, and once you have faced up to the question of distribution, a fair distribution, the market generates terribly unequal distributions. Once you've corrected those two huge externalities, then within those social conditions, I think you can rely to a considerable degree on the individualistic market to allocate efficiently private goods, or goods which are non-rival and not basically private goods. They're the first two, limiting the scale and limiting the inequality of distribution. Those are collective decisions, social constraints on the market. And if you put those constraints on the market, then the market is in a better position to justly allocate resources. And so this is not, it's ironic to me that many people have criticized this as being a market-based solution and relying on the market and just surrendering to the market. No, this is a very large change, a constraint on the standard neoclassical view of the market, so much so that most neoclassical economists are not willing to accept it. So I don't see that it's a surrender to free market ideology at all. It just says, the market can be a pretty good servant, even though it's a bad master. It can be a pretty good servant if you correct the prior social conditions of not allowing it to run roughshod over scale limits and not allowing it to run roughshod over the distributive equity problem.
Okay. As a means of prefacing my last question, I return the conversation to the theme of natural capital maintenance by highlighting Professor Daly's call to stop counting the consumption of capital, especially the depletion of natural capital, as income. I then asked Professor Daly to expand on this and what it implies for gross domestic product, GDP, as a measure of national income.
Well, you've done a whole lot more work on that than I have. But the important thing about that is that you can be right in you can use the standard economists' own definitions. I won't say against them, but appeal to them, because this is based on the Hicksian definition of income is the maximum that a community can consume in a time period without lowering its capacity to produce and consume the same amount in the next period. So Nobel laureate in economics, J.R. Hicks, that's his standard definition of income. And in GDP, we don't respect that at all. We say, well, you can cut down the entire forest this year and sell it all this year and count it all as income. Well, what happens next year? Well, next year you can't do that again. And so it's not income, it's capital consumption. And the way we do GDP really counts not only with forests, but with fisheries and mineral deposits and all sorts of other resources. We consume natural capital and count it as income. And not only produce goods, but the production of most goods involves the joint production of bads. So the very act of production, causes depletion, pollution, tired laborers, injury, and so forth. And of course, bads accumulate into ilth, which is John Ruskin's opposite term for wealth. So we're producing, as we produce in the physical world, we generate not only wealth, but also ilth, and we need to compare those two. We don't count ilth, we don't subtract bads. Well, there's a good reason for that. Nobody wants bads, so there's no demand for bads, so bads don't have a price. So how are you going to put them into GDP without a price. Well, what do we do instead? We produce anti-bads to protect ourselves from the unwanted effects of the bads, and we count those as net goods, which is, not really proper accounting either. So I think those are two big problems, and there are other problems with GDP accounting.
And that's it. So thank you, Professor Daly. Right, so now questions, I suppose. You're going to do this? You do it. Questions? How much time have we got for questions? 5 minutes. Paul and... Paul, hang on. Thanks, Paul. Yeah. So I only have 5 minutes for questions because we are running a bit late. Don't want to cut into Stephanie's time.
Okay,
she's the superstar.
Economic framework is because it seems to me that it's critical for us to have sound theory on which to base our transition to sustainability, right? And I also understand that economics can't do absolutely everything, but it seems to me that if this attempt to build sound theory for sustainability is going to work, it not only needs to be ecological, and I think learn from Indigenous knowledges there, but also needs to be based on more than the rational economic man. And I guess I'm talking about the things that happen in the black box called household, but also in the social institutions that support the household, like health and economics, and what has been traditionally the role of women, the production and reproduction of the labour force, to put it in Marxist terms. But I just can't see it, or I haven't heard a word about any of that all day so far. And I appreciate you don't have time to give me a proper answer, but I just want to ask the question, do you believe that that also can be done?
Well, yes, it can be done. So GDP does ignore that informal part of the economy. And I'll be talking all about that tomorrow when I talk about the genuine progress indicator. The genuine progress indicator... well, it's called informal because it's not captured by national accounts. Okay, we don't pay for household labour. It's unpaid. That's why it's called unpaid. So any sort of unpaid work is classed as part of the informal economy. Now, with the genuine progress indicator, that's included, and it's enormous, as I'll show tomorrow. So if you're around tomorrow, I'll be talking about the genuine, and it makes a huge difference to the way we look at the benefits and costs of economic activity. So whereas GDP ignores it, the genuine progress indicator includes all that stuff. Okay.
Hi there.
Yeah. Hi.
My question goes to sort of touching on the point of measurability as well. So you need to be able to measure something to know whether we're going to hit up against that boundary or, in fact, if we're past that boundary. And
Okay.
my question is about measuring natural capital and, I guess, ecological diversity.
Yep.
And whether you could say something about how ecological economics deals with that.
All right. Well, so we've got one speaker, Robert Costanza, on Sunday. He'll be talking about natural capital. But tomorrow in my presentation on the genuine progress indicator, I'll mention something a bit about the ecological footprint. Because at the global level, the ecological footprint is about 70% larger than global biocapacity. So in other words, the rate at which, that rate of throughput, the input of resources, output of waste, if that was the global economy, that's now 70% larger than what the global natural environment can sustain in the long term, 70% beyond it. And it passed the biocapacity of the planet in about the early 1970s. So basically the global economy is larger than what can be sustained in the long term. And it's only being maintained at its present physical scale simply because, as Herman Daly was talking about, we're consuming natural capital. Now, we're not living off the income provided by natural capital, the natural income, but the natural capital. And you can't keep doing that forever. Yeah, so 70%, when the ecological footprint is 70% larger than biocapacity, that basically means that the rate that we're currently using resources, generating waste, in order for it to be sustained in the long term, we'd need 1.7 Earths, and of course we've only got one Earth. So that gives you some idea as to how unsustainable the level of economic activity is at the global level at present. So I'll talk about that, and you can also do it for individual countries, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. All right, so that's basically it, I think. Have we got one more question? Yeah.